Welcome to Bookbound Audio, where stories come alive through the magic of words and sound. This is a sanctuary for those who crave the thrill of a gripping mystery, the chill of a spine-tingling horror, and the journey through the depths of human imagination. Here, every tale is a doorway to another world, narrated to pull you in and hold you captive until the very last word. Hit subscribe and join the Bookbound Audio family, where the next unforgettable story is just a click away. Let the books bind you to adventures that will linger long after the audio fades. The chill of early autumn hung in the air, sharp and restless, as I followed Elliot Brooks into the weathered confines of a cluttered antiques shop on the edge of town. The place had an old, somber air, filled with relics of lives once lived and long abandoned. It was the kind of shop that seemed to breathe its own stories, though none of them felt particularly inviting. Dust motes floated lazily in the dim light streaming through tall, narrow windows, and the faint scent of aged wood and musty fabric tickled my nose. Somewhere in the back, a clock ticked its slow, deliberate rhythm, lending an uneasy sense of life to the otherwise quiet space. Elliot moved with purpose, his trench coat swishing faintly as he navigated the labyrinthine rows of furniture, paintings, and artifacts. His steps were light but deliberate, as though he was hunting something elusive among the forgotten treasures. I trailed behind, always a step slower, my curiosity tempered by the sense that we were about to uncover something best left hidden. "I received a letter about this place," Elliot said, his voice low and smooth, breaking the silence without shattering it. A woman claimed she inherited something unusual after her aunt's passing. Said it wasn't just furniture but something darker. I raised an eyebrow, my gaze sweeping over the eclectic assortment of items. "And you think it's here?" Elliot didn't answer, his green eyes scanning the room with the intensity of a predator zeroing in on its prey. He had that look again, the one that meant he'd already pieced together half the puzzle before I'd even realized we were playing. We reached the far corner of the shop, where a solitary chair sat bathed in an almost reverent light from a high window. At first glance, it was nothing remarkable, an antique armchair with a high backrest, its dark mahogany frame polished to a rich, eerie sheen. The upholstery was a deep, faded green, patterned with faint, swirling vines. Yet something about it felt distinctly out of place, like it didn't belong here, or anywhere, for that matter. Elliot slowed as he approached, his gaze narrowing. He crouched slightly, studying the intricate carvings along the chair's arms and legs. I stepped closer, drawn by his focus, but unable to shake the prickling sensation creeping up my spine. "It's beautiful," I admitted, though my words felt hollow even as I said them. There was a weight to the chair, a presence that defied its inanimate nature. "What's so special about it?" Elliot didn't look up. "Do you see these carvings?" he asked, tracing a gloved finger along the chair's armrest. The wood seemed to glisten faintly under his touch, as if alive. "They're not decorative, they're symbols. Old ones. This isn't just a chair, Miguel. It's a story waiting to be told." I frowned, leaning closer to examine the carvings. They were intricate and strange, unlike any patterns I'd seen before. Spirals intertwined with jagged lines, forming shapes that seemed almost deliberate, though their meaning eluded me. In the faint light, I thought I saw the grooves shift and twist, but I dismissed it as a trick of the shadows. "Any idea what they mean?" I asked, my voice quieter now, as though afraid to disturb the air around us. "Not yet," Elliot said, straightening. "But they're not the sort of symbols one carves lightly. They're deliberate, ritualistic. I'll need more time to decipher them." A faint shuffling sound drew my attention to the shopkeeper, an older woman with piercing blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She approached slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as though to steady them. "You've taken an interest in Margaret's chair," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of caution and something else, relief, perhaps, or resignation. "Margaret?" Elliot prompted, his gaze sharpening. The woman nodded. "My aunt." This was her favorite piece, though she always said it wasn't meant for comfort. She believed it absorbed things. Grief, sorrow, emotions too heavy for the living to carry. I felt a chill crawl up my spine at her words, but Elliot remained unflinching. "What happened to her?" The woman hesitated, her eyes drifting to the chair as though it might answer for her. "She passed peacefully, I think." But there was something different about her in those last years. Detached, empty. Like she'd lost more than time. She used to say the chair took it from her, bit by bit, until there was nothing left. Her words lingered heavily in the air, thick and suffocating. I glanced at Elliot, expecting skepticism or disbelief, but his expression was as unreadable as ever. He was considering her story, weighing it against something unspoken. "Has anyone else used the chair?" Elliot asked finally, his tone calm but probing. The woman shook her head. "No one dares. It's been here for years, unsold. People sense something about it. You're the first to take a real interest." Elliot stepped back, his gaze lingering on the chair for a moment longer before turning to me. "We're taking it." I blinked, caught off guard. "We are?" He nodded, already pulling out his wallet to settle the transaction. The shopkeeper hesitated but ultimately accepted his payment, her hands trembling slightly as she wrote out the receipt. "This isn't a choice to take lightly," she warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "That chair carries a darkness you might not be prepared for." Elliot met her gaze, unflinching. "We'll handle it." As we loaded the chair into the back of Elliot's car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were taking more than just an antique home with us. The air seemed heavier around it, as though the chair itself was a living thing, aware of its journey and what awaited it. "You're awfully confident about this," I said as I climbed into the passenger seat, watching Elliot start the engine. "What makes you so sure we're not biting off more than we can chew?" He glanced at me, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Because, Miguel, the best stories are the ones that don't let you walk away." I didn't respond. The road ahead stretched into the distance, and the chair sat silently in the back seat, its presence an unspoken promise of the mysteries yet to come. The road stretched ahead of us, a winding ribbon flanked by tall, shadowy trees that swayed gently in the breeze. The sky had deepened to a muted grey, with the sun dipping low on the horizon. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears, as if the world itself had paused to take notice of what we carried. I glanced back at the chair in the rear seat, its carved frame catching the fading light in a way that made it seem alive. Elliot kept his eyes on the road, his calm demeanor unshaken by the heavy silence that had settled over us. "You feel it too, don't you?" I said, leaning slightly toward him. My voice was subdued, as though afraid of disturbing the charged atmosphere. Elliot didn't look at me, but his grip on the steering wheel tightened. "It's not a matter of feeling," he replied, his tone measured. "It's a matter of knowing. That chair doesn't belong in the back of my car. It doesn't belong anywhere." His words sent a chill through me. I turned back to the chair, half expecting to see it watching me, but it sat as still and silent as any piece of furniture should. Yet, despite its stillness, there was something deeply unsettling about it. The carvings on the wood seemed to shift in the dim light, as though mocking my attempts to dismiss my unease. I forced myself to look away, focusing instead on the blurred scenery beyond the window. We reached Elliot's home just as the last traces of daylight faded into night. His house, a modest colonial nestled at the edge of town, was as orderly and meticulous as the man himself. The porch light cast a warm glow over the entrance, its steady illumination a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness lingering in my chest. Elliot parked the car and stepped out without a word, his movements quick and efficient. I followed suit, my boots crunching against the gravel as I walked around to the back seat. Together, we lifted the chair from the car, the wood cold and unyielding beneath my hands. Its weight seemed disproportionate, as though it carried more than its physical mass. Inside, Elliot said, his voice firm but quiet. "We'll examine it properly in the study." I nodded, grateful for the task as it gave me something to focus on. We carried the chair up the steps and into the house, navigating its narrow hallway until we reached the study. The room was lined with bookshelves filled with ancient texts and case files, the air thick with the scent of paper and leather. A large desk sat near the window, its surface cluttered with notebooks, sketches, and assorted artifacts. Elliot gestured for me to set the chair down in the center of the room. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The chair sat under the room's yellow lamplight, its carvings casting faint shadows against the wood floor. There was an odd sense of finality in the way it rested there, as though it had claimed the space as its own. Elliot circled the chair slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied it from every angle. "These symbols," he murmured, trailing off as his fingers brushed the armrest. "They're older than I thought. They're not just decorative, they're deliberate. Ritualistic." I crossed my arms, watching him work. "Any idea what kind of ritual?" "Not yet," he admitted, his tone sharp with concentration. "But it's not the kind of thing you find in common folklore. This is something rare. Something ancient." I felt my stomach twist at his words. Elliot was no stranger to the occult. He had faced things that most people wouldn't dare to imagine. But there was a gravity to his voice now, an edge of unease that set me on edge as well. I leaned closer to the chair, studying the carvings with a mixture of fascination and dread. The spirals and jagged lines seemed to pulse faintly under the lamplight, as though alive. The wood itself had an unnatural sheen, its surface smoother than any natural material should be. I ran my fingers along the backrest, noting the jagged marks I'd seen earlier. They felt almost deliberate, as though someone had tried to destroy the chair but failed. "What about the shopkeeper's story?" I asked, breaking the silence. "She said it absorbs sorrow. Do you think that's true?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. He crouched beside the chair, studying the carvings with meticulous care. "Whether it's true or not doesn't matter," he said finally. "What matters is what people believed about it. Belief shapes reality in ways most people don't understand." I frowned, his words stirring a vague discomfort in my chest. I had always been the skeptic to his believer, but there were moments, like this one, that made me question where the line between myth and truth really lay. Elliot stood, his gaze still fixed on the chair. "I need to cross-reference these symbols," he said, his voice brisk. "There's something familiar about them, but I can't place it yet. You should take a look at the Willoughby Journal in the meantime, see if you can find anything useful." I nodded, pulling the journal from where Elliot had left it on the desk. The cover was worn, its leather edges frayed from years of handling. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, filled with cramped handwriting that was both elegant and chaotic. I flipped through the entries, scanning for anything that might shed light on the chair's origins. The journal was a strange mix of personal musings and cryptic observations. Margaret Willoughby had clearly been a troubled woman, her writing steeped in sorrow and paranoia. She spoke of dreams filled with weeping trees, of shadows that whispered her name, and of a chair that seemed to carry the weight of her pain. Her descriptions were vivid but fragmented, as though she were fighting to capture something beyond her understanding. One passage caught my attention. The chair is not a vessel, but a thief. It takes what it cannot feel, leaving behind hollow shells of what once was. To sit is to lose, but to destroy is to unleash. I read the words aloud, the weight of them sinking into the room's silence. Elliot glanced at me, his expression unreadable. To destroy is to unleash, he repeated, his voice soft but firm. That fits with what the shopkeeper said. If Margaret believed it, then there's something worth considering. The night stretched on as we worked, each of us absorbed in our tasks. Elliot continued to sketch the carvings, his movements precise and methodical, while I pored over the journal, piecing together fragments of Margaret's troubled life. The air grew colder as the hours passed, the room's warmth unable to stave off the chill that seemed to emanate from the chair itself. It wasn't until the clock struck midnight that the first whisper broke the silence. It was faint, barely audible, but it stopped us both in our tracks. I looked toward the chair, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was soft and mournful, like the wind through a hollow tree, but it carried an unmistakable weight, an echo of something deeply human. Elliot met my gaze, his expression grim. "Do you hear it?" I nodded, my throat dry. "It's coming from the chair." The whisper faded, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I stepped back, my hands trembling as the weight of the moment settled over me. Elliot moved closer to the chair, his hand brushing its armrest. For the first time that night, I saw hesitation in his movements, hesitation and something else. Fear. "Whatever this is," he said quietly, "it's only the beginning." And in that moment, I knew he was right. The air in the study had turned brittle, weighted by the unnatural hush that followed the whispered sound. It wrapped around us, hollow and suffocating, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I stared at the chair, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. A single question hung, unanswered, in my mind: what had we brought into this house? Elliot remained motionless, his sharp features lit by the yellow glow of the desk lamp. His eyes bore into the chair as if willing it to betray its secrets. For a moment, I could have sworn there was something watching us, something unseen but undeniable. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering ceased, leaving behind a silence that felt even more sinister. "Did you hear it?" I finally asked, my voice coming out hoarse. I forced myself to meet Elliot's gaze. He nodded, slow and deliberate. "I did. It's not the house, Miguel. It's the chair." I swallowed hard, the back of my throat dry. What was it saying? Elliot's expression remained unreadable, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the mounting tension. "Not words," he said, almost to himself. "It's sorrow. A presence trying to reach out." "Reach out for what?" I countered, my unease sharpening into something closer to dread. "For release," he replied simply, his voice steady. His calmness only made me feel more unnerved. Elliot had seen his share of darkness, walked through it time and again with nothing more than his intellect and resolve. If something about this chair had shaken even his steel composure, I knew we were in deeper trouble than I'd realized. Elliot's attention shifted back to the chair, his analytical mind clearly working through possibilities. I rubbed my temples, trying to piece together the scattered fragments of information we'd gathered. Margaret Willoughby's journal, the symbols on the chair, the warnings about destroying it, all of it felt like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. "What now?" I asked, finally breaking the heavy silence. He tapped his finger on the desk, a faint drumming sound that seemed to echo louder than it should in the stillness of the room. "I need more information," he said. "The journal gives us context, but there are gaps. I need to cross-reference these symbols against the archives. See if there's a pattern." Elliot moved to the nearest bookshelf, his hand skimming over the spines of weathered tomes. He pulled several volumes with titles that spoke of ancient rites and occult symbols, their cracked leather bindings a testament to their age. Watching him work, I felt a flicker of admiration for his single-minded determination. It was this focus that made him the best at what he did, even when the path forward seemed impossible. While he delved into his research, I kept my distance from the chair. There was something predatory about it, a quiet malevolence that seemed to radiate from its polished surface. The carvings appeared almost alive in the dim light, the intricate spirals and jagged lines shifting subtly, as though they were moving just out of sight. Time crawled by, measured only by the steady flipping of pages as Elliot worked. The cold seemed to intensify, seeping into my bones despite the warmth of the study. I rubbed my hands together, casting a wary glance toward the chair. That's when I noticed it. The air around the chair seemed different, heavier. It shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt, but with a cold, ethereal quality that made my stomach turn. A soft sound, barely more than a whisper, began to creep into the room. It wasn't distinct, more of a mournful murmur that ebbed and flowed like the tide. My hands clenched into fists as I fought the urge to flee. "Elliot," I said, my voice tight with tension. "Do you hear that?" He looked up from his book, his green eyes narrowing as he turned toward the chair. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the faint shimmer surrounding it. Then, without a word, he rose from his seat and approached the chair with measured steps. "Stay there," he instructed, his tone brooking no argument. I didn't need to be told twice. My feet felt rooted to the floor as I watched him examine the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He crouched beside it, studying the air around it with the same intensity he'd shown earlier. "It's reacting," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's feeding on something, sorrow, maybe grief. Something emotional." The whispers grew louder, filling the room with an unearthly cadence. It wasn't speech, not exactly, but it carried an undeniable weight. It was as if the chair was speaking directly to our minds, bypassing words entirely. I clutched the back of a nearby chair, my knuckles white as I struggled to keep my composure. Elliot reached out, his fingers hovering just above the armrest. The shimmer intensified, the air rippling like water disturbed by a pebble. For a heartbeat, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to crush the very air from my lungs. Then, chaos erupted. The lamp on the desk flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Books flew from the shelves, their pages flapping like the wings of trapped birds. The whispers rose to a fevered pitch, a cacophony of sorrow and anguish that clawed at my mind. The chair itself seemed to shudder, its polished wood creaking under an invisible force. "Elliot!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the din. He yanked his hand back as if burned, stumbling away from the chair. The moment his hand broke contact, the room fell deathly still. The lamp flickered one last time before steadying, its warm glow illuminating the chaos left in the wake of the chair's outburst. I rushed to Elliot's side, my heart pounding. "Are you all right?" He nodded, his breathing heavy but controlled. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice carried an edge of unease. "But this is worse than I thought." I glanced at the chair, its once polished surface now dull and cracked, as though the outburst had drained something from it. The carvings, however, remained as intricate and menacing as ever, their jagged lines seeming to mock our helplessness. "What just happened?" I demanded, my fear giving way to frustration. "It's not just an object," Elliot said, his voice grim. "It's a conduit, a channel for something far more dangerous. Whatever Margaret bound to this chair, it's still here. And it's not going to let go without a fight." The weight of his words settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I looked at the chair, its presence now even more menacing in the aftermath of the outburst. It was clear that we were in over our heads, but there was no turning back now. Elliot straightened, his composure returning as he adjusted his coat. "We need to learn more," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about the chair, it's about the ritual that created it. The answers are out there, and we're going to find them." I nodded, though my hand still trembled at my sides. The chair had shown us its power, but it was only the beginning. Whatever darkness we had unleashed, it was far from over. The following morning, a grey haze hung low over the town, cloaking the streets in a damp stillness. Elliot had barely said a word over breakfast, if his hurried cup of black coffee even counted as such. He was already immersed in deciphering the arcane markings from the chair, poring over ancient tomes and faded maps spread across the study table. I, meanwhile, had been roped into assisting in my own way, sifting through Margaret Willoughby's fragmented journal entries for anything he might have overlooked. "This entry here," I said, holding up the brittle page. "She writes about a tree marked by sorrow. That's not just poetic language, is it?" Elliot's attention snapped to me. His pen froze mid-note as his eyes narrowed. "Read it to me." Clearing my throat, I skimmed over the script, translating its florid handwriting aloud. "Deep within the hollow of the forest lies the tree marked by sorrow. Its bark bears the weeping scars of those it has claimed. The chair is but a fragment of its grief, carved to contain what the earth cannot." When I finished, the room fell silent, save for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. Elliot ran a hand through his dark hair, his gaze drifting to the chair as if weighing some invisible measure. "It isn't just the chair," he said at last, his voice low but resolute. "The tree, whatever's left of it, is the source. And if Margaret's words are accurate, its existence was intentional. It was meant to carry something. Something that's still trying to escape?" I ventured, my unease growing with every passing second. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned his attention to one of the maps on the table, his finger tracing the jagged line of the nearby forest's boundary. "We're going to find it," he said. Before I could protest, we were packing up. Elliot's resolve left no room for argument, though my gut churned with foreboding. What little daylight had broken through the clouds began to fade as we left the house and made our way to the woods. The forest loomed ahead like a gaping maw, its skeletal branches reaching upward as if to ensnare the overcast sky. Elliot led the way, his strides deliberate and unwavering despite the crunch of brittle leaves underfoot. I kept close behind, clutching the journal like a talisman. A damp chill clung to the air, and the deeper we went, the more the world seemed to fade. The hum of distant cars and the chatter of birds gave way to an oppressive silence, broken only by the sound of our breathing. "I need to know, Elliot," I said, breaking the quiet. Do you think Margaret was telling the truth? About the tree, the chair, all of it. Elliot didn't stop. Truth is subjective when it comes to belief, Miguel. But something real lies at the heart of her words. People rarely create myths without a kernel of reality behind them. That answer did little to settle my nerves. I tightened my grip on the journal, scanning the woods for any sign of what, exactly? A cursed tree? An ancient ritual site? The deeper we ventured, the more absurd it seemed, and yet the more palpable the tension in the air became. It wasn't long before the trail began to change. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled trunks twisted like agony frozen in wood. Moss and fungi clung to their bases, and the air grew heavier, as if laden with invisible hands pressing down on my chest. "Elliot," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Are you sure we're in the right place?" He didn't respond immediately, his attention fixed on the compass in his hand. When he finally spoke, his tone was as measured as always. "We're close. Can't you feel it?" I wanted to deny it, to claim he was imagining things, but I couldn't. There was a presence here, a weight that defied explanation. It wasn't just the oppressive quiet, it was the sense that the forest itself was alive, watching us with unseen eyes. Finally, we came upon a clearing. At its center stood a tree unlike any other in the forest. Its massive trunk was blackened and split, as though struck by lightning, and its bare branches twisted upward in jagged, unnatural angles. The ground around its roots was barren, devoid of the moss and undergrowth that carpeted the rest of the forest floor. Even from a distance, I could see faint markings etched into its bark, carvings eerily similar to those on the chair. "This is it," Elliot said, his voice barely audible. He stepped forward, his eye scanning the tree with the intensity of a man unearthing a lost relic. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to stay back, to turn and run from this place, but I forced myself to follow. As we approached the tree, the air grew colder, the silence more suffocating. The markings on the bark became clearer, spirals, jagged lines, and symbols I didn't recognize but instinctively feared. Elliot crouched near the base of the tree, his gloved hand brushing against the bark. "It's ancient," he murmured. "Older than this forest, maybe. The markings aren't random, they're deliberate. Part of the ritual Margaret described." I knelt beside him, my gaze drawn to a series of shallow grooves at the base of the trunk. They looked like claw marks, jagged and uneven, as if someone, or something, had tried to tear the tree apart. "What do you think happened here?" I asked, my voice low. Elliot didn't answer immediately. His attention was fixed on a patch of ground near the roots, where something metallic glinted faintly in the weak light. He reached out, brushing away the dirt to reveal a rusted ceremonial dagger, its blade adorned with similar carvings. "Whatever they bound to this tree," he said, holding up the dagger, "it wasn't meant to stay here. The ritual was incomplete." His words sent a shiver down my spine. The idea that something had been left unfinished, that it might still linger, was more terrifying than I cared to admit. Suddenly, a low, mournful sound filled the clearing, a deep groan that seemed to emanate from the tree itself. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the ground beneath us seemed to tremble. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the tree's presence was asserting itself. "Elliot!" I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. He didn't move, his gaze locked on the tree as though entranced. The groaning grew louder, a sound that carried with it an overwhelming sense of sorrow. It wasn't just noise, it was emotion, raw and unfiltered, flooding the air around us. "Get back!" Elliot ordered, finally breaking free of his trance. He grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the tree just as its roots began to writhe, tearing through the barren soil. We stumbled back to the edge of the clearing, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The tree's groaning subsided, leaving behind an eerie stillness that was somehow even more unsettling. I looked at Elliot, his usually composed expression marked by a rare flicker of uncertainty. What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze still fixed on the tree. When he finally spoke, his tone was grim. "We need to leave. Now." I didn't argue. Together, we turned and made our way back through the forest, the oppressive weight of the clearing lingering long after we'd left it behind. The chair, the tree, the ritual, they were all connected, and whatever we had just witnessed was only the beginning of what lay ahead. The crunch of dry leaves beneath our boots seemed louder now, amplified by the eerie silence of the forest. The clearing had faded into the shadows behind us, but I could still feel its presence lingering like a stain on my skin. Even the air seemed heavier, colder, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Elliot's pace was steady, unfaltering, and his unyielding calm both frustrated and comforted me. "You felt that back there," I said, breaking the stillness between us. My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, as if the forest could hear us and we might awaken something that was better left undisturbed. Elliot nodded, but didn't look at me, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "It's old," he said simply. "Older than anything I've come across before." His tone was deliberate, the kind of tone that warned me he was still processing what we'd seen. It was the same voice he used when walking through crime scenes, that razor-sharp focus allowing him to see connections others would miss. But this wasn't just a crime scene, it was something far darker. And as much as I wanted to press him for answers, I knew better than to disturb the process. The walk back to his house felt longer than the journey out, as though the weight of what we'd encountered was pulling us down. When we finally emerged from the forest, the sight of the quiet, winding street was almost jarring in its normalcy. The world outside the woods seemed oblivious to the lurking unease we carried with us. Elliot said little as we reached the house, his movements mechanical as he unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of old paper and leather greeted us, familiar but now tinged with an unwelcome heaviness. The chair still sat in the center of the study, its presence looming, its carvings etched deeper into my mind than ever. I set Margaret's journal down on the desk, the worn leather cover feeling heavier in my hands than it should. Elliot immediately went to the bookshelf, pulling volumes from their places with practiced precision. He moved with purpose, his demeanor more intense than usual, as though racing against something unseen. "What do you think we're dealing with?" I asked, though I already knew the answer wouldn't be comforting. He paused, the weight of his silence palpable. "A binding," he said finally, his voice low. "Something, an entity, an emotion, a force, was bound to that tree centuries ago. The chair is a fragment of that binding, a vessel meant to contain what the tree couldn't." His words sent a shiver through me. "And now it's trying to escape?" Elliot didn't respond, his focus already back on the books in front of him. I sighed, rubbing my temples in frustration. It was moments like these that reminded me just how much I didn't understand about the world Elliot operated in. His ability to navigate the unseen, the unexplainable, had always been remarkable, but this was beyond anything I'd witnessed before. As the hours stretched on, the study grew colder, the chill seeping into my bones despite the crackling fire Elliot had lit in the corner. The chair seemed to radiate its own kind of cold, an unnatural presence that pressed against my senses. Elliot worked tirelessly, flipping through pages, jotting down notes, cross-referencing symbols and patterns. I tried to help where I could, my focus on Margaret's journal, but the fragmented entries only raised more questions. One passage stood out among the others, its ink faded but still legible. Asterisk, the sorrow is not mine to carry. It weeps, it whispers, it screams for release. To destroy is to unbind is to undo all that remains. Asterisk. I read the words aloud, my voice faltering as their weight settled over the room. Elliot glanced at me, his expression inscrutable. It's consistent with what we saw, he said after a moment. The bindings on the tree, the markings on the chair, they're meant to contain something. Destroying them would release it. And what happens if it's released? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Elliot's silence was answer enough. The clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the room like a harbinger of something far worse. The air grew heavier, the fire dimming as shadows crept across the walls. My gaze shifted to the chair, and I froze. The carvings seemed to pulse faintly, the spirals twisting in slow, deliberate movements. Whispers filled the room, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Elliot stood, his focus sharpening as he approached the chair. It's responding, he said, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. It knows we've seen the tree. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their mournful cadence. They weren't words, but the emotion behind them was unmistakable: sorrow, loss, despair. I backed away, my chest tightening as the weight of the sound pressed against me. "Elliot," I said, my voice trembling. "What's it trying to do?" He didn't answer, his attention fixed on the chair. The air around it shimmered faintly, the same ethereal glow we'd seen in the clearing. Elliot reached out, his hand hovering just above the armrest. The whispers surged, their pitch rising, the room trembling as the chair seemed to vibrate under an invisible force. "Don't!" I shouted, panic overtaking me. But Elliot didn't pull back. His fingers brushed the carvings, and the room erupted. Books flew from the shelves, the pages scattering like fallen leaves. The fire roared to life, casting wild, flickering shadows that danced across the walls. The whispers became screams, deafening and unrelenting. The chair shook violently, its polished wood splintering as cracks spidered across its surface. Elliot stumbled back, his hand clutching his chest as he gasped for air. I rushed to his side, my heart pounding as the chaos reached its peak. The chair emitted a low, guttural groan, the sound reverberating through the room like a dying animal's cry. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell deathly silent. The fire dimmed, its flames flickering weakly. The chair sat still, its surface marred by deep cracks, its carvings more jagged than ever. Elliot leaned against the desk, his breathing heavy, his face pale. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice shaking. He nodded faintly, his gaze locked on the chair. "It's stronger than I thought," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at the chair, its presence more menacing than ever. Whatever we were dealing with, it wasn't just a relic of the past, it was alive, and it was angry. The bindings, the whispers, the tree, they were all connected, and we had only scratched the surface of the darkness we'd unleashed. "Elliot," I said, my voice firm despite the fear gripping me. "What now?" He straightened, his composure returning as he met my gaze. "We need answers," he said simply. "And we don't have much time." I nodded, though my hand still trembled at my sides. The chair had shown us its power, but I had a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. As I looked back at the journal, its faded pages lying open on the desk, one thought lingered in my mind. Whatever darkness had been bound to the chair and the tree, it was no longer content to remain silent. The sound of my breath echoed louder than it should have as I sat in Elliot's dimly lit study, the faint crackle of the fire doing little to cut through the suffocating tension. The journal lay open before me, its brittle pages catching the flickering glow, but the words on the paper were no longer my focus. My mind kept drifting to the clearing, the way the ground had seemed to heave like it was alive, the groan of the tree as if it were in pain, or perhaps something else entirely. Elliot sat across from me, his chair angled slightly toward the cursed object at the center of the room. The chair. Its presence was oppressive, undeniable, as though it was actively aware of us watching it. Elliot's sharp green eyes had barely left its cracked surface for the last hour, his thoughts a mystery locked behind his calculated exterior. He hadn't spoken much since we'd returned from the forest. That silence, usually a comfort in its reliability, now clawed at me, each second of it making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. I cleared my throat, more to fill the void than out of necessity. So, the tree, the dagger, the chair, it's all connected. But what's the purpose? Why bind anything to a chair, of all things? Elliot broke his gaze away from the carved wood and met my eyes, his expression pensive. Containment, he said after a moment, his voice as deliberate as always. Something powerful enough that they feared its release, but also something they couldn't destroy outright. Binding it to an object meant it could be hidden, controlled, at least in theory. In theory? I repeated, frowning. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Binding rituals are dangerous, Miguel. They require precision, understanding, and a considerable amount of power. If the ritual was incomplete, or if something went wrong. He trailed off, his eyes flicking back to the chair. I followed his gaze. The carvings etched into its surface seemed to twist and shift, not unlike the symbols on the tree. Whether the movement was real or a trick of the low light, I couldn't say, but either way, it set my teeth on edge. You think that's why it's acting up? I asked, hesitant to put it into words. Elliot nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. The bindings are unraveling, piece by piece. What we felt in the forest, that was just the beginning. A cold knot twisted in my stomach at his words. I pushed myself away from the desk, standing and pacing the length of the room. The air felt heavier now, weighted with unspoken possibilities. As much as I tried to focus on the details, the journal, the symbols, the fragmented history we'd uncovered, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. What do we do about it? I finally asked, turning back to Elliot. Destroy it? Rebind it? Burn the whole thing to ashes and hope for the best? Elliot shook his head, his composure steady in the face of my growing frustration. If Margaret was right, destroying it would release whatever's bound to it. Rebinding it isn't an option without knowing the specifics of the original ritual. And burning it? He let out a faint breath, almost a laugh. Let's just say that fire wouldn't solve this problem. I stopped pacing, facing him fully. Then what? He didn't answer right away, his silence drawing the tension tighter. His gaze shifted past me, focusing somewhere just beyond my shoulder. Before I could turn to look, a faint noise broke the stillness, a soft creak, like the slow bending of wood under pressure. It was coming from the chair. Elliot was already on his feet, his movements sharp and precise as he stepped toward it. I stayed where I was, frozen in place as the sound grew louder. The firelight flickered across the chair's surface, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. The carvings seemed to deepen, their edges sharp enough to cut, as though the very wood was coming alive. Then came the whisper. It was soft, barely more than a breath, but it carried an unmistakable weight. It filled the room, pressing against my ears, my chest, my very thoughts. It wasn't a voice, not in the conventional sense, but rather an impression, a sensation of sorrow so profound that it made my knees weak. Elliot reached out, his hand hovering just above the armrest. "Miguel," he said, his tone low and commanding. "Get the journal." I didn't argue. My hands moved on instinct, grabbing the worn leather-bound book and flipping through its pages even as the whispers grew louder. The words blurred before my eyes, my focus shattered by the weight of the sound, but I forced myself to concentrate. "There's got to be something," I muttered, half to myself. "Something that explains this." The room grew colder, the fire in the hearth all but extinguished. Shadows pooled in the corners, creeping along the walls like liquid darkness. The chair shuddered, its frame groaning under the strain, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure, faint and indistinct, seated in its depths. "Elliot," I called, my voice trembling. "There's something in the chair." "I know," he said, his voice sharp with focus. "Keep looking." The journal's pages fluttered under my fingers, the brittle paper nearly tearing as I searched for anything, any clue, any answer. Margaret's words swam before me, fragmented and cryptic. Asterisk, to sit is to lose. To bind is to suppress. To unbind is to awaken. Asterisk. My breath caught in my throat. "Elliot," I said, louder this time. "I found something." But before I could explain, the room erupted. The chair convulsed, its frame buckling and cracking as the shadows converged on it. The whispers turned to wails, anguished and deafening, as though the sorrow bound within it was breaking free. Books flew from their shelves, the desk overturned, and the fire roared back to life, casting wild, flickering light across the chaos. Elliot shouted something, his voice lost in the cacophony. He reached for the dagger we'd taken from the forest, its rusted blade glinting in the firelight, and drove it into the armrest of the chair. The effect was immediate, the wails cut off, replaced by a silence so profound it was almost painful. The chair stilled, its frame sagging as though the force within it had been drained. The carvings dulled, their jagged edges smoothing over into something almost normal. But the air remained heavy, the oppressive weight of what had just occurred lingering like a shadow. Elliot straightened, his breathing heavy but controlled. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable, and for the first time since we'd begun this investigation, I saw something in his eyes that unsettled me more than the chair ever could. Fear. "What just happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the now dormant chair. When he finally spoke, his words were soft but heavy with meaning. "It's not over." The atmosphere inside Elliot's study was suffocating. The weight of the air seemed to press against my chest, making every breath feel laborious. The room, lit only by the dying embers of the fire, was an unsettling place to be after what we'd just witnessed. The silence after the chair's violent eruption wasn't one of relief, it was the kind of silence that comes before another storm, a deceptive, fragile stillness. Elliot stood at the center of the room, his posture rigid as he stared down at the damaged chair. Its surface bore deep cracks now, like jagged scars slashed across its once pristine finish. The carvings on the wood seemed dulled, but no less menacing, their twisted patterns reminding me of the veins of some dark and diseased organism. The air around it was still cold, unnaturally so, and I could almost feel the chair's presence gnawing at the edges of my senses. "What happened, Elliot?" I asked, unable to keep the tremor out of my voice. My hand, still gripping the edge of the desk for balance, was clammy and cold. "What the hell did we just unleash in here?" Elliot dragged a hand through his disheveled hair, his jaw tight with frustration, or maybe something deeper. "We didn't unleash anything," he said finally, his voice low and restrained. "Not yet. But the bindings are unraveling. Whatever they used to seal this thing, it's breaking apart, piece by piece." He stepped closer to the chair, as though daring it to react again. I wanted to tell him to stop, to back away from the cursed thing, but I knew it would be futile. Elliot didn't back down, not from men, not from mysteries, and certainly not from something like this. "The dagger," he muttered, almost to himself. His gaze flicked to the ancient blade, now lying abandoned on the floor where he dropped it. It disrupted the energy, stopped the escalation, temporarily. "Temporarily?" I echoed, my unease mounting. "You mean this thing is going to flare up again?" He looked at me then, his green eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into his features. "Not if, Miguel. When? And next time, it won't stop so easily." The finality of his tone made my stomach twist. I stepped away from the desk, running a hand through my own hair as I tried to process what was happening. The chair, the tree, the whispers, all of it was spiraling into something far more dangerous than I'd anticipated. And the worst part was that I couldn't see a way out. "We need to go back," Elliot said suddenly, breaking my train of thought. "Go back where?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "The clearing," he replied, his voice firm. "The tree. The binding started there, and it's there that we'll find our answers." I stared at him, incredulous. "Elliot, that place, it's not natural." "You felt it too, didn't you?" The way the air felt alive, the way the ground seemed to move. "Going back there is necessary," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "We don't have a choice, Miguel. If we don't figure out how to contain this thing, it won't just be the chair or the study. It'll spread. And once it does, we won't be able to stop it." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I knew he was right. Elliot always had a way of cutting through the fear and doubt, of finding the path forward even when it seemed impossible. I nodded, though my hands were still shaking. "Fine. Let's go." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The night was colder than before, the kind of cold that seeped into your skin no matter how tightly you bundled yourself. We walked through the forest in silence, our breath visible in the moonlight as it curled and disappeared into the air. Elliot carried the dagger in one hand, its rusted blade glinting faintly in the weak light. I clutched a lantern, its flickering flame casting long, wavering shadows across the trees. The forest felt different this time. It wasn't just the cold or the silence, it was the sense of being watched, of unseen eyes following our every move. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as though the forest itself was conspiring against us. My pulse quickened with every step, the dread building in my chest until it felt like a physical weight. "Stay close," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the stillness. His eyes scanned the path ahead, ever vigilant. "We're almost there." I nodded, though my throat felt tight. The lantern's light flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, something just out of reach, something that disappeared the moment I turned to look. I quickened my pace, keeping as close to Elliot as I could without bumping into him. When we finally reached the clearing, I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. The tree stood exactly as we'd left it, its gnarled, blackened branches stretching upward like skeletal arms. But the clearing itself had changed. The ground was cracked and uneven, the earth scorched in places as though it had been burned from within. The air was thick with the scent of ash and decay, and the oppressive weight of the place was stronger than ever. Elliot approached the tree cautiously, his movements deliberate. He knelt near its base, examining the markings carved into its bark with the same meticulous care he'd shown in the study. "The carvings are fading," he said after a moment. "The bindings are deteriorating faster than I thought." I stood at the edge of the clearing, my lantern held high as I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint creak of the tree as it swayed in the breeze, or perhaps under its own weight. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to leave this cursed place behind, but I forced myself to stay. Elliot drew the dagger from his coat, its blade gleaming ominously. "We need to reinforce the bindings," he said, his tone as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "The markings, the symbols, we can carve them back into the tree." "Seriously thinking of touching that thing," I said, my voice rising with disbelief. "Elliot, you saw what it did back in the study. And that was just a fragment of its power. If you get too close—" "I know the risks," he said, cutting me off. "But this is the only way. If we don't act now, the bindings will fail completely. And then it won't just be this clearing. It'll be everywhere." Before I could argue further, he stepped closer to the tree, his movements purposeful. The lantern's light cast his shadow long and distorted across the cracked ground, making him seem almost like an extension of the tree itself. He raised the dagger, the tip poised above the faint remnants of a carving, and began to etch the symbol back into the bark. The reaction was immediate. The tree groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath our feet. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight pressing down harder as the shadows around the clearing began to move. I gripped the lantern tighter, my knuckles white as I watched Elliot work, his focus unwavering despite the chaos unfolding around us. The shadows coalesced, forming shapes, figures, just beyond the edge of the clearing. They were indistinct, their forms shifting like smoke, but their presence was undeniable. I felt their gaze on me, their intent palpable, and my blood turned to ice. "Elliot," I called, my voice trembling. "We're not alone." "I know," he said, his tone steady but tense. "Keep them back." "Keep them back? How the hell am I supposed to do that?" My voice rose, panic creeping in. Elliot didn't answer, his focus locked on the tree as he carved another symbol into its bark. The dagger's blade glinted in the faint light, each stroke precise and deliberate. The groaning grew louder, the shadows closing in, and I knew we were running out of time. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I stepped forward, the lantern held high as I faced the encroaching darkness. The figures hesitated, their movement slowing as the light touched them. I took another step, my heart pounding in my chest, and the shadows recoiled slightly, their forms wavering. "Just a little longer," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the din. "Almost done." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My focus was locked on the shadows, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I held the lantern steady. The figures shifted, their forms rippling like water, and I felt the weight of their hatred, their sorrow, bearing down on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the groaning stopped. The figures dissolved, fading back into the darkness as the air grew still. Elliot lowered the dagger, his breathing heavy, and stepped back from the tree. The carvings on its bark glowed faintly, their edges sharp and defined once more. "It's done," he said, his voice barely audible. I lowered the lantern, my hand shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. The clearing was silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting slightly, though the unease remained. I turned to Elliot, his expression unreadable as he studied the tree. The silence in the clearing was so profound it felt unnatural. My breath came in uneven gasps, the lantern shaking in my grip, its weak light flickering across the cracked earth. Elliot hadn't moved since he'd finished carving the symbols into the bark of the tree. His eyes remained locked on the faintly glowing lines, his features caught somewhere between triumph and trepidation. The oppressive weight that had filled the air moments before had lifted slightly, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The shadows had receded, yes, but they weren't gone. They lingered just beyond the edge of the clearing, patient and hungry. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice unsteady. I hated how small and fragile it sounded, but the words spilled out before I could stop them. Elliot finally tore his gaze from the tree and turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Not yet," he said, his tone measured. "The bindings are reinforced, but the energy we felt back in the study, that's still here, still active." I swallowed hard, my eyes darting to the jagged branches above us. The tree seemed more alive than ever, its bark pulsating faintly under the moonlight. The carvings Elliot had etched into it glowed like embers, casting an eerie light onto the scarred ground below. It was as though the tree was breathing, its every exhale whispering secrets I couldn't hope to understand. "What now?" I pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the distant rustle of leaves and the faint creak of wood shifting under unseen forces. Elliot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the base of the tree, his movement slow and deliberate. He knelt, brushing aside loose soil and charred roots with gloved fingers. The blade of the ancient dagger glinted weakly in the light as he held it at his side, the weapon still faintly humming with residual energy. "There's more beneath the surface," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "The markings, the decay, it's deeper than the tree itself. The ground here has absorbed it, whatever it is." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in like lead. "You mean it's not just the chair or the tree, it's the land?" He nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening. The ritual wasn't isolated. Whatever Margaret and the others tried to contain, it didn't stay confined to one place. The energy leached into everything, the wood, the earth, the air. It's why the chair exists as it does, why the bindings are so fragile. They weren't just trying to bind something to a tree. They were trying to trap it in the world itself. The implications of his words sent a shiver down my spine. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed ground. But Elliot didn't move. He was still crouched near the base of the tree, his head tilted slightly as though listening to something I couldn't hear. "Elliot," I said, my voice sharper now. "We've seen enough. Let's get out of here before." Before I could finish, the earth trembled beneath our feet. It wasn't a quake, not exactly, not the kind that rolls and shifts the ground in unpredictable waves. This was something subtler, more deliberate. It was as though the ground itself was shuddering with a deep, guttural breath, the kind that comes before a scream. My balance faltered, and I reached out blindly, clutching at the rough bark of a nearby tree to steady myself. Elliot rose to his feet, his jaw tightening as the trembling intensified. The lantern's light danced wildly across the clearing, casting jagged shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The carvings on the tree burned brighter, their faint glow pulsing in rhythm with the shaking ground. "Something's reacting," Elliot said, his voice tense but controlled. His gaze swept the clearing, scanning for the source of the disturbance. "The ritual, it's drawing out whatever's buried here." I took a shaky step toward him, my grip on the lantern tightening until my knuckles ached. "Drawing it out?" "Elliot, this is exactly what we didn't want to happen." His expression darkened, his focus shifting to the tree once more. "The ritual was incomplete," he said, his voice rising slightly to be heard over the growing din. "They bound it, yes, but they didn't purge it. It's been festering here for centuries, feeding on the land, the sorrow of everyone who's come near it. And now—" Before he could finish, the trembling ground gave way. It was like the earth had split open beneath our feet, a deep, resonant crack that reverberated through the clearing. A jagged fissure tore through the soil near the base of the tree, its edges glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The shadows that had lingered at the edge of the clearing surged forward, coalescing into a dense, writhing mass that pulsed with malevolent energy. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest as the shadow mass began to take shape. It wasn't human, not even remotely. Its form was abstract, constantly shifting, its edges dissolving and reforming in a sickening, undulating rhythm. But its intent was clear. It radiated hatred, sorrow, and an overwhelming sense of despair so powerful it felt like it was dragging me under. Elliot didn't flinch. He stepped forward, the dagger clutched tightly in his hand, his eyes locked on the entity as though he could will it to stop. "It's feeding," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Feeding on the bindings, on the sorrow that was meant to contain it." The entity shifted, its form rippling as it turned toward us. I felt its gaze, though it had no eyes, only the crushing weight of its attention, bearing down on me like a tidal wave. My legs threatened to give out beneath me, but I forced myself to stand, to meet its gaze even as every instinct screamed at me to flee. "What do we do?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the rising cacophony of groaning earth and whispering shadows. Elliot didn't hesitate. "Hold the light," he ordered, his tone brooking no argument. I raised the lantern higher, the flickering flame casting a feeble glow against the encroaching darkness. The entity recoiled slightly, its form rippling as though the light caused it pain. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Elliot moved closer to the tree, his every step deliberate despite the trembling ground beneath him. He raised the dagger, its blade catching the lantern's light, and plunged it into the glowing fissure at the base of the tree. The reaction was immediate. The entity shrieked, a sound so piercing and inhuman it felt like it was tearing through my very soul. The ground convulsed, the fissure widening as a surge of light burst forth, illuminating the clearing in a blinding, otherworldly glow. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into the air like smoke caught in a gale. Elliot held his ground, his grip on the dagger unwavering as the light pulsed and surged around him. The tree groaned, its blackened branches shuddering as the carvings burned brighter than ever. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire clearing was on the verge of collapsing in on itself. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The light faded, the shadows dissipated, and the earth stilled once more. The tree stood silent and unmoving, its bark scarred but intact. The fissure at its base had closed, leaving only a faint glow that pulsed faintly in time with my own racing heartbeat. Elliot lowered the dagger, his shoulders sagging slightly as the tension finally bled from his frame. He turned to me, his face pale, but resolute. "It's contained," he said simply. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My legs gave out beneath me, and I sank to the ground, the lantern slipping from my grasp. The weight of the night's events bore down on me, leaving me breathless and shaken. But even as the silence returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The forest's oppressive silence followed us back like an unwelcome spectre, its echoes still clinging to my thoughts as Elliot and I trudged through the brittle underbrush. The clearing was behind us now, but I could still feel the weight of that damned tree's presence in every step, as if the earth beneath me still trembled from its wrath. My hands were scraped raw from gripping the lantern and pulling myself up from the jagged ground. The faint glow of dawn flirted with the treetops, casting slivers of pale light through the skeletal branches above us. Still, the forest refused to yield its secrets, its shadows clinging stubbornly like cobwebs spun too tightly. Elliot was silent, his figure moving ahead of me with mechanical precision. The rusted dagger hung loosely in his grip, its once dull blade now carrying a strange, dark sheen. It didn't glow, it didn't need to. It simply felt wrong, as if it pulsed faintly with a heartbeat that wasn't its own. I wanted to ask him how he knew we were safe now, how he could be so sure that whatever had stirred beneath the tree was truly contained, but the words caught in my throat. He was no stranger to the weight of the unknown. For me, though, the fear was thick and relentless, gnawing at my resolve as the edge of the forest crept closer. The whispering began before we reached the car. At first, I thought it was the wind, weaving through the branches and sighing against the earth. But the cadence was wrong, too deliberate, too mournful, as though it carried meaning just out of reach. I stopped walking, my stomach twisting as I turned my head toward the sound, straining to pick apart its intent. Elliot didn't stop. His stride never faltered, even as the faint whispers grew louder, wrapping themselves around us like tendrils of fog. "Elliot," I called, my voice hoarse. "Tell me you hear that." "I hear it," he said simply, his tone devoid of surprise or fear. He slowed just enough for me to catch up, his green eyes glinting sharply as they flicked toward me. "It isn't coming from behind us anymore." His words chilled me more than any night wind ever could. My mouth went dry, and my grip on the lantern tightened as I instinctively turned to glance over my shoulder. The forest behind us was still eerily so. The trees no longer seemed like trees, their blackened forms bent and crooked, each branch curling into the air like skeletal hands reaching for nothingness. "Then where is it coming from?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his pace, forcing me to stumble after him as the path twisted and narrowed, the lantern's flickering light casting erratic shapes along the ground. It wasn't long before we broke free of the trees, stepping out onto the overgrown gravel road where Elliot's car waited. The worn, grey vehicle looked even smaller against the vast expanse of the empty sky, its chip paint catching the faint glow of the approaching dawn. Relief washed over me as my boots crunched against the familiar gravel, but it was short-lived. "Elliot," I began, but he silenced me with a subtle wave of his hand. He crouched beside the car, his gloved fingers brushing the dust-coated glass of the rear window. I followed his gaze, squinting against the growing light until my heart sank. Symbols. They weren't etched into the glass, no, they were simply there, burned into the dust as though an unseen hand had carved them with perfect precision. They were the same spirals and jagged patterns we'd seen on the chair, on the tree, on the dagger itself. My pulse quickened, the lantern shaking slightly in my grip as I struggled to comprehend what I was seeing. "We didn't end it," I said, my voice trembling. It wasn't a question. "Did we?" Elliot stood slowly, his expression unreadable as he turned to face me. He didn't speak right away, his eyes searching the horizon as though it might hold answers. When he finally met my gaze, his face was pale, but his resolve remained intact. "We sealed the tree," he said carefully, "but whatever was bound to it, it's been displaced. It's not gone, Miguel. It's here." As if on cue, the whispers surged, louder and closer now. They weren't mournful anymore, they were angry, desperate, each syllable twisting through the air like knives. I staggered back, the sound filling my ears, my chest, my very mind. It was like 1,000 voices, all clawing to be heard, their anguish tangible and unrelenting. "Get in the car," Elliot ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. I didn't need to be told twice. I stumbled toward the passenger door, yanking it open and practically throwing myself inside. The lantern clattered to the floor as I fumbled with the seatbelt, my hands trembling violently. Elliot slid into the driver's seat a moment later, the dagger resting on his lap as he twisted the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but the whispers didn't fade. If anything, they grew louder, pressing against the thin metal walls of the car like a storm trying to break through. The tires spun against the gravel as Elliot pulled onto the road, his hand steady on the wheel despite the cacophony surrounding us. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, the faint light of dawn doing little to lift the oppressive darkness that clung to us like a shadow. I kept my eyes on the horizon, afraid to look back, afraid to see what might be following us. "We need to trap it," Elliot said, his voice sharp and focused. "It's still tied to the objects, connected through the ritual. If we can isolate it, contain it, we might have a chance to stop this." I turned to him, my fear giving way to frustration. "How? How do we trap something we can't see, something that moves and follows?" And my words faltered as the car lurched violently, the steering wheel jerking in Elliot's grip. "Hold on," he growled, his knuckles white as he fought to keep control. The whispers surged again, piercing and relentless, their intensity drowning out even the roar of the engine. The car swerved, the tires skidding against the asphalt as Elliot slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop threw me forward, the seatbelt biting into my chest as I gasped for air. The whispers ceased. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the engine and the frantic pounding of my own heart. I looked at Elliot, his face pale and slick with sweat, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I turned slowly, dread pooling in my stomach as I followed his gaze. The shadows were back. They stretched across the road behind us, darker and more defined than before. They rippled and shifted like a living thing, their shapes unnatural and wrong. And at their center, just barely visible, was the faint outline of something, a figure, indistinct and shrouded in darkness, watching us. Elliot's voice cut through the thick air. "Miguel, take the dagger." "What?" I stammered, tearing my gaze from the shadows to look at him. He thrust the blade toward me, his expression stern. "Take it," he repeated. "It's tied to the binding, it's the only thing we have that can affect it directly." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the hilt. The dagger seemed to pulse faintly, its weight almost magnetic as it drew me closer. The fear that had gripped me since we entered the clearing threatened to overwhelm me, but Elliot's steady gaze anchored me. I nodded, wrapping my fingers around the cold metal as he shifted the car into gear. "We're ending this," he said, his voice resolute. The car surged forward, the headlights cutting through the darkness as the figure in the shadows loomed closer. The whispers returned, louder and more desperate than ever, but I gripped the dagger tightly, its weight steady in my hand. I didn't look back. As the shadows closed in around us, the horizon ahead glowed faintly with the promise of dawn. And for the first time, I began to believe that we might make it. The light of dawn spilled across the horizon in hesitant hues, bathing the landscape in an ethereal glow that felt almost defiant against the lingering darkness. The car's headlights faded into irrelevance as the sun began its steady ascent, stretching its fingers of light toward the whispering shadows that had pursued us. Elliot's grip on the wheel remained taut, his green eyes fixed on the road ahead, while I sat beside him, the dagger heavy in my trembling hands. "We've outrun them for now," Elliot said, his voice calm but firm. "But this isn't over. Not until we sever the final connection." I stared at him, my mind racing. My hands ached from clutching the dagger too tightly, the sharp tang of fear still coursing through my veins. Sever the connection? How? We don't even know what's keeping it tied to us. Elliot's jaw tightened as he considered my words. Then, without warning, he swerved the car onto a narrow side road, the tires crunching against the loose gravel as the vehicle skidded to a halt. The clearing ahead was small and unremarkable, bordered by dense foliage and dotted with smooth stones, each one worn down by years of exposure. But at the center of the clearing stood something familiar, a tree stump, old and rotted, its surface engraved with spiraling symbols that mirrored those we'd seen on the cursed chair. "It's the key," Elliot said simply, stepping out of the car. I followed hesitantly, the dagger clutched tightly in my grasp. The morning air was crisp and biting, and I could feel the tension in my muscles as I approached the stump. It radiated the same oppressive energy we'd felt back at the tree and in the study, its presence a lingering echo of something far darker. "How did you know this was here?" I asked, keeping my voice low. The whispers in the air had faded, but I could still feel their weight pressing against my thoughts. "Margaret's journal mentioned it," Elliot replied, his tone distracted as he crouched beside the stump. This stump wasn't just part of the sorrow tree, it was the source of the wood used to craft the chair. The energy flows through it, through the objects bound to the ritual. If we sever the connection here, we might have a chance to end this. He reached for the dagger, his gloved fingers brushing the edge of the blade. "Give it to me." I hesitated, the weight of the dagger suddenly unbearable. My grip tightened instinctively, and for a moment, I felt a strange resistance in the weapon itself, as though it wanted to stay in my hand. But Elliot's steady gaze grounded me, and I reluctantly handed it over. "Be careful," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot nodded, rising to his feet. He held the dagger firmly, his focus locked on the stump as he positioned the blade above one of the symbols. "This has to be precise," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "Any mistake could leave us worse off than before." The first strike came with a reverberating crack. The blade sank into the stump, its edge cutting through the ancient wood with unnatural ease. The air shifted immediately, growing colder and heavier as the symbols began to glow faintly. Elliot moved quickly, his movements precise and deliberate as he carved new lines across the engravings, breaking their continuity. As the final stroke connected, the clearing erupted with light. The stump groaned, its weathered surface splitting apart as the energy bound within it surged outward. The ground trembled beneath our feet, the stones rattling and shifting as the clearing filled with an intense, pulsating glow. The oppressive weight lifted suddenly, replaced by a palpable sense of release, a deep exhale from the earth itself. Elliot staggered back, his breathing heavy, the dagger falling from his grip. The light began to fade, the symbols on the stump losing their glow as the clearing returned to a fragile stillness. I rushed to his side, gripping his arm for support as he straightened, his eyes scanning the stump for any signs of lingering energy. "It's done," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "The connection is severed." Relief washed over me, but it was fleeting. The clearing felt quiet now, too quiet, and I couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. The energy we'd battled wasn't gone, it was dispersed, scattered into the air, the earth, and the objects tied to the ritual. But for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope that we might finally be free of its grasp. Elliot turned to me, his expression softening slightly. "You did well, Miguel," he said, his voice carrying a rare note of reassurance. "I couldn't have done this without you." I let out a shaky laugh, the tension finally breaking as I met his gaze. "You say that like it's over?" His smile was faint but genuine. "It's not, but it's a start." The rising sun bathed the clearing in warm light, its rays stretching toward the edges of the forest as if pushing back the shadows once and for all. I took a deep breath, the crisp air filling my lungs as the weight on my chest began to ease. The whispers had faded completely now, their presence dissolved into the growing light of day. Elliot retrieved the dagger, its surface now dull and lifeless. He held it for a moment, studying its worn blade before tucking it into his coat. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward the car. "There's still work to be done." I nodded, following him back to the vehicle. The road ahead seemed brighter now, the horizon stretching wide and open as the sun climbed higher into the sky. And though the weight of the past lingered, its grip was weaker now, its power diminished by the dawn. As Elliot started the engine and we pulled away from the clearing, I felt a strange sense of closure. The curse that had haunted us was still out there, fractured and scattered, but its hold had been broken. For the first time since this nightmare began, the world felt lighter. And though the journey ahead remained uncertain, I knew one thing for sure. We had survived. And together, we would face whatever came next. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the shadows with the Curse of Mourning Wood. If you felt the tension, the chills, and the thrill of unraveling mysteries with Elliot Brooks and Miguel Vasquez, then Bookbound Audio is the place for you. Here, the story doesn't end, it only begins. By subscribing to Bookbound Audio, you become part of an immersive world where every tale pulls you deeper into adventure, mystery, and the uncharted corners of imagination. Don't miss out on our next story, full of twists, turns, and the kind of suspense that keeps you up at night. Hit that subscribe button and join us for more captivating tales brought to life through the power of storytelling. Stay curious. Stay bound to the books. And we'll see you in the next story.